This week's podcast is called The Union Dividend, Debunked. And we really enjoyed our conversation with Stuart Donald.
Stuart's done a few articles for Byline Times in particular. We'll link below, and he also has a great website with masses of detail, which we'll link to that as well. But essentially, he's a data analyst and researcher, and this is his passion.
It's really interesting, and we think there'll be a few eye-openers for you in this podcast.
Definitely.
If you watch or listen to our podcast, you'll know that both Fiona and I like statistics.
Yeah, I mean, what I really appreciated, he doesn't take things for granted. Like, we hear about this Union Dividend, and he's gone, I'm going to go and look back at the data. And he's gone back to before the war and tracked it through. And he's discovered that this narrative that we get told constantly as if it's incontrovertible fact actually isn't fact. And there's a completely different way of looking at some of these things, or understanding where they've come from and whose fault it is as well. Before we bring Stuart into our studio, we'll just remind you, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel, please do so and click the little bell, because that way you get notified when we put out new stuff. Let's get Stuart in and get the stats rolling.
Yep. So it is true. It is true, isn't it? Like, Scotland does receive more funding per head of the population than other parts of the UK. That's the funding that comes from Westminster, and that's what's referred to as the Union Dividend. And in other words, the dividend that we up here all benefit from because we're part of the great, wonderful Union. So we'll get to whether it actually is a dividend or not. But can you say, just to start off with, can you say is that actually true, and where did that term come from?
So it is true, as you've just accurately summarised. The starting point is when the spending is calculated for the various, say, nations of the UK, then we end up with 20%, roughly 20% per head of population more than England does. Actually, England is the benchmark, not the rest of the UK. Mm-hmm. It would appear to have been always happening, right, as far as there are records, right? So right back to at least the Second World War, but before that, Scotland ended up with more, and most of that is to do with specific one-off deals done by Secretary of States. So not linked specifically to anything strategic. And this is probably the thing I think is the biggest missing component in this conversation, is that there is absolutely nothing strategic about how all this these vast sums of money are raised for our putative needs, right? We
talk about block grants, which I think should be block refunds, actually. And the Union Dividend, it's not related to anything to do with what Scotland raises in terms of money, is it? No.
So, I mean, it's not written down logically anywhere. If you research it online, you'll eventually get three things that explain why we get more money. And it's never really been properly related to any bottom-up understanding of what Scotland needs, right? So the first one is the one that Malcolm Offord spoke about on debate night 2 weeks ago.
Let me give you a couple of numbers, because for every £100 spent by the UK and England, Scotland is spent £125. And there's a reason for that, because Scotland has got 8% of the population and 33% of the geography. And the idea of the United Kingdom is that wherever you live in the United Kingdom, you get the same services. So in Stornoway, it should be the same as Streatham. It costs a lot more money to deliver in Stornoway than it does in Streatham. So there's an equalisation payment. That's what the Barnett formula is about. It's about geography and population, and that's a fair system, right? But the reality is that the Scottish Government benefits from the UK and the strength of the UK, and I would fight.
Strictly speaking, the Barnett formula was designed to try to reduce Scotland's share of public expenditure. It's not been very effective for all sorts of reasons.
Well, it was written on the back of a fact packet 50 years ago. It's not been updated ever since. And the reality is that everybody in Scotland is about £2,200 better off for being inside the UK.
And that's Scotland's terrain is less, is more compromising, it's more difficult, lochs, islands, mountains. Scotland's population is materially less dense than the rest of the UK, which means that the unit cost of providing a unit of education or a unit of health in terms of service is necessarily higher, right? Now, remember, point out that obviously England is the second most densely populated country in Western Europe after only the Netherlands. Okay, so that as a benchmark is already a bit suspect. We are more densely populated in Scotland than the Irish and also the Norwegians. Okay, so if you take that in the round, then the cost of health and education in Scotland is the cost that it is. That's probably the only objective explanation for why we might get more. The other two reasons, one reference I found from a Hansard in the 1990s says, yes, well, of course, Scotland's always been more deprived and Scotland's health's been poorer and Scotland's needs, therefore, are greater. Right now, again, the establishment narrative around those points is more Scotland just chooses to live a less healthy existence, and therefore these costs are actually Scotland's problem, if you want, in which case this is where you start getting into the generosity idea, that the extra money we get is generous, and therefore this idea of a dividend. And the other one, which is cited every now and again, is the fact that our population is older, right? Now, that's linked, you could argue, to the health side of things, but then it's also linked to one of the things that I cover in the paper that I did for Bylines on the Union Dividend, and that's that our net migration has been lower, so we've had more Scots that have left than people have come in. That means that you don't get the youth that necessarily comes with immigration, therefore your fertility rate is typically lower. And then Scotland's, in particular, male death rate is staggeringly bad, right, compared to anywhere else in the UK and therefore anywhere else in Europe. And when you start understanding why these things happen, so Scottish male health, for example, and you look at what the British government has been doing, right, in terms of prioritising Scotland's demographic needs, right, then you start seeing that this thing that's called a dividend actually would more comfortably be described as a reparation, okay? Scotland suffers as a result
Damages.
of damages, because we've never had a government that actually prioritises our needs as a country, as a group of people. You know?
Yeah. So when the Barnett formula started to be applied,
it started in the 1970s by this guy, Joel Barnett, which is why it's called the Barnett formula. And it was linked to the fact that we had started talking about devolution for Scotland. And so the idea that they needed to understand better what our needs were, I say with a smile, sort of emerged, from there. Now they put it in place, and it has stayed in place, since then, all the way up until devolution, and then after devolution.
Right, okay.
And that story is as disturbing or as disappointing in terms of just the picture of neglect that you get, as what I explained, because Barnett, all he could really find when he was researching how much does Scotland need were these one-off deals that had been done mostly in the 50s and 60s by states of Scotland that indicated that Scotland got something like 16 to 20% more than the English per head of population. That's what was established there. So, but the thing is, when people talk about the Barnett formula, they're not talking about that, okay? The really important bit, so how much money do we get? Well, actually, the question should be, well, what do we need, okay? So that's what we established we needed in 1978, right? That a mark above 20%. The Barnett formula is then nothing more than this basic arithmetic system that works out how our allocation for public spending changes year on year to do with population, okay? Yeah. So it's been as high as 130%, it's been as low as, I think, 112 or 113. But the markup, the dividend, has only ever been calculated once, and that was based on nonsense that were deals from, like the boomer generation, right? The immediate post-war era of rationing. That's it. That's the science of the thinking behind.
Right. That was me. One of them. So that's really interesting because, if you use the word dividend, it's like, it's got connotations of like it's a reward or, you deserve it somewhere. And we'll get to how you've debunked some of those things you've mentioned. I had a wee look online to just find out how unionist parties up here in Scotland what spin they put on that. And I found something. It's on the Fife Conservative and Unionist Party website. It's from last year, and they're quoting Liz Smith, who's their regional MSP. And so a lot of the things that they put is, of course, they just spin it the way that they want it.
The Union Dividend has risen sharply to £2,400. Huge dividend Scotland derives from being part of a strong UK. Scotland in UK is £2,400 per person better off. But SNP have squandered that funding settlement. SNP legacy, the highest taxes in the UK, brutal cuts to essential services. These are startling and inconvenient home truths for the SNP.
You can see how, I mean, it was very quick to take all that in, but you can see what they're doing. They're sort of saying, oh, look, you know, you're part of the great union, and each person gets nearly £2,500 a year, more than your pals get down south. And the SNP have just squandered that, and we've got highest taxes, and they've been brutally cutting services, and that's really embarrassing for the SNP. So, I mean, you're not going to blame them for spinning something like that, because that's kind of what political parties do. But you've really gone into the detail behind that whole thing and debunked a lot of that, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. So you know, that is a brilliant piece. I mean, you know, the Tories do it, the Labour Party does it. I think the union-friendly Scottish establishment do it as well. And the first thing in that hits me is they immediately blame the SNP. Obviously, that's for like tactical political gain today. But what they're saying is that these failures, and the fact the money isn't spent properly, has all happened in the SNP's watch. And the SNP is a phenomenon itself of the Scottish Parliament, because it's only in power and able to do these things because of the Scottish Parliament. But as I say, my work goes back as far as I could take it to understand how long we've been getting, you know, more money. And as I say, it goes back as far as something like the 1890s, right? I mean, that's much patchier there, but certainly since the Second World War, you can explain it away. And so the base explanation is that this money has been being squandered, right? I mean, there's no evidence that has been doing anything useful, because Scotland has continued to have the worst demographic statistics, certainly in the UK, and of most of our northwestern European peers. You know, but what I think is even more interesting, and I'm still working on how to find a way to make this as powerful a narrative as possible, is that when you link together some of the things we've already touched on, you can see that there's been no one at the wheel, right? If you take the death rate amongst men, so we were second only to Finland immediately after the Second World War across all age groups of men, right? Poorest death rate, okay? And this is in the 50s and the 60s, when the UK was leading the world with the welfare state phenomenon. So there are many things in Scottish society that are getting much better as a result of that. But male death rate continued, you know, to plummet. By the 1970s, Finland was already starting to overtake Scotland. So Finland had the same sort of, if you want, challenges of Scotland around things like cardiovascular health, poor diets, excessive drinking, and so on. In the 1970s, a series of Finnish governments of different persuasions managed to oversee change such that they leapfrogged Scotland. And by the 1980s, they were doing better than us, and they have continued to sort of like run away from us, right? Finland wasn't benefiting from the discovery of North Sea oil at that time, right? We were, so was Norway. And then we get into the 1980s, and the Thatcher revolution, where, again, trying to be as generous as possible, you know, radical new ideas about how to recast the British economy. We know what happened in Scotland. We know what happened to heavy industry. At that point, Scottish male deaths becomes almost immeasurably worse than everywhere else in Europe. And you can trace the more recent issues to do with drugs-related deaths, right, that actually target men of a certain age. I think it's between ages of 30 and 50. You can trace that cohort of men, right, with highest sort of drugs deaths in Europe, back to the 70s and the 80s. They are the children of Thatcherism, right? So this is different from the devastation that Thatcher caused in terms of destroying communities and people having to leave and unemployment. This is a legacy of health, right, that you can trace. And we can't singularly, obviously, blame Thatcher in that era for that, but it's obviously a hugely important element. If you contrast Scotland's male death rate trends with Norway, Ireland, anywhere, right, then there's these two lines that go off the chart, right, as you get up to the current times, and they're the men of that generation. Okay, so what we're saying is that for men between ages of 20 and 30, historically, more men in Scotland per 100 or 100,000 are dying at that age group than in England or in any other country in the world, right? And then this gets increasingly worse, okay, when you get into the Thatcher era. Part of that is because of like net outward migration, but much of it as well is because of just poor health. The consequences of suffering this level of devastation is now known to have, like hugely detrimental, hugely impactful effects on health.
So,
well, I mean, I suppose it's tied up in that, because that graph is your overall net population, right? So again, what's interesting about this graph is that because of our higher death rate, because of our lower birth rate, right, and because of lower immigration, so fewer people coming and fewer people, younger people coming and having children in Scotland, we were the only country out of the peer groups, so that's the British countries and the relevant European ones, that suffered 3 consecutive decades of net outward migration. Now, everyone else has struggled with net positive migration, as we know, but look at our stats.
Was that not the period when relatively, the oil money was flowing? I know from my peers, my cousins, for example, were in the oil industry in the 70s, and they all went abroad. They followed the money, and they followed the jobs. So is that what exactly that big dint is? Yeah,
that is exactly that. I mean, everybody that's grown up in Scotland, or lived in Scotland, like in our era, will know hundreds of people, dozens of people where that's the case, and that's it. So it happens in that decade because of the scale of the devastation, particularly in the west coast of Scotland. But as you say, that's when oil starts coming on taps, and this is one of the things where I say, would the government of Norway or Ireland or Finland or Switzerland or Portugal have been able to preside over data like that for 3 consecutive decades over, that's going to be 5 or 6 governments anyway? No way, right? Yeah. Why did this happen here? Because we have allowed Scotland to be run by interests that are not aligned with us, right? So with the best will in the world, the Labour Party would have said and would have tried to have been doing that, but the level of failure is staggering. So whether you think it's neglect or whether you just think it's a consequence of, a mismatch of interest, doesn't matter. Right, they failed to serve the needs of this country.
It was over about 3 decades, wasn't it? And as you say, if we'd been running Scotland, there would have been something would have been done to, or at least tried to do something about that, in the way that Finland and Norway, other kind of independent countries have got the choice to be able to do that. We can't do that because we don't hold those levers.
In the late 70s in Norway, they had been investing in very high risk strategies that a country like Britain, particularly this attitude towards the state and the state doing stuff, was already becoming very unfashionable. Thatcher pioneered that. They had taken the huge risks in setting up what's now, I think it's called Equinor, but the Norwegian state involvement in the oil industry, production, exploration and so on. And by that time, in the 80s, Norway's already starting to benefit from that. Yet the revenue potential from Scottish oil was greater than Norway, but here we have us being the sort of an incubation space for these experiments. Can you destroy heavy industry overnight and hope that it gets replaced with something else? And remember as well, right? I think it's always useful to point out, well, why this looks almost too black and white to be true. Well, but every time you raise this stuff in Scotland, what we're told is, in Newcastle or in Manchester or in Liverpool or Wales, largely the same there, right? So we're all in the same boat, and this is one of the things I think is good about the modern era, is that we seem to now be accepted, sort of putting forward a narrative that's about Scotland, the idea, Scotland the place, Scotland the community, and I think that's where we need to sort of push that harder, because if you buy this data, there's just no question, is there? There's no question that the experience has been disastrous for us.
Yeah, and that graph that we just looked at, where there was the drop in the 80s, that must have had follow-on effects about the overall demographic spread of our population, because I'm assuming mostly the people who'd leave would be the younger people.
Yeah,
exactly. And this then feeds into, why is it then, one of the graphs either side of that in that deck, why is Scotland so old? Because it's so old because our young people left. That means that obviously that changes the average age. Yeah. But then who's producing the kids? And then when you couple that with the fact that the immigration waves that came to the UK disproportionately favoured other parts of the island, then that again sort of like drives and contributes to that. So then with older age, we're more expensive again because we have higher health costs and so on. The only country that in the mix there that I think consistently over that period had a worse demographic than us was was Germany. And that's singularly because of the reunification. Like 17 million people that had lived half a century in the misery of communism, or failed communism. The thing that changes all this, that turns it on its head, and for the first time in living memory, Scotland's net migration flips to becoming positive. There was the move of the European Union to the east. In particular, you'll remember the influx of the Poles, but not just the Poles, mostly Poles in our case. And that started to drive, a change in demographic, younger people coming through, the bedrock for a modern, healthy sort of like society and economy. And then we all know what happened to that, don't we? Because another part of the island decided that we were going to leave the European Union.
I saw that and I thought, wow, just look at that. That just tells you such a picture, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's it. And so the thing about Brexit, that it sort of diversifies if I can say this without sounding too sensationalist, but it diversifies just the agency of neglect, the experience of neglect we've experienced, because it's got nothing to do with the failure of the British state to look after our demography. This is completely different. This is, another part of the island, and its size and its scale itself voting against the establishment through the misery it's been caused. And that's another thing we can come on to.
I forget who it is now who put the paper to Westminster arguing for a Scottish visa. Yeah. That's your evidence why we need one, isn't it?
I know.
Does the graph for England look any different from that?
Because they would see that as a success. They would see that as, you've got to grips with immigration and got rid of all those foreigners.
Yeah. I don't know. Actually, I think it probably looks similar. I mean, there will have been many hundreds of thousands, obviously many more EU nationals that left England. I suppose I've focused on the fact that we are so precariously, because of our poorer demographic state, right? The age of the population, the fact that we're shrinking. England, through the general positive migration from elsewhere, I suppose, doesn't have the same level of acuteness, but it won't be that different, to be honest. But the English voted right for that. We didn't, and it's not just that we, you could say emotionally we want to be European. It doesn't matter. That would be enough democratically to warrant us getting what we wanted. We've actually got a serious demographic economic need. It's much more acute than it is south of the border, and so the fact that we're still denied this, even the Erasmus stuff, that is now accessible to Starmer with his birthday, he won't dare, because he knows that there's a risk he upsets his voter base south of the border, and that's it. So we wait,
Yeah.
Although ironically, they also need those people coming in to work in their care service and work in their hospitals and all those things. So they just think they don't need foreigners. There is a racist element to the narrative that comes out.
Yes, that's true.
Even still with the Labour in there, shamefully.
Where do you think you could go with this amount of data that you've provided? Because you have debunked such a lot of the spin that's put on that dividend and the way especially unionists talk about it. So how do you think that can be best used?
Well, the reason I came into it was because the other work that you talked about that I've been doing, which is probably the main core of the work that I do, which is looking at the link between the first past the post system, the fact that drives countries to the right, and the level of inequality in the UK. So one of the main problems that comes from strident neoliberal right-wing politics is that governments spend less on public services, right? Yeah. So we in the UK since the 1980s have spent something like 30% a year every year since 1980, less than the average of our sensible European peers, right? When I say sensible, I mean the most relevant ones. 30% on average every year. Since then, that's almost half a century. And you think about how big that number is, 30% of just even the health bill. That's an enormous sum of money to be denied year on year. And that's why this graph is for me is so important. It really is the sort of one of the most powerful things that kills the idea of the Union Dividend. So the blue bar is obviously Scotland, and the red bar is the rest of the UK. And the fact that our bar is bigger shows you what dividends is, and that's what the hashed lines tell you. That's what the dividend element is. That's what we're invited to book as supreme generosity. This is what you're getting back by staying in the union. So you should be more grateful, and we get told that, blah, 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 and so on, right? Then you look at the right-hand side, and again, this is just our peers. That includes Ireland and Austria and France, so not just the Scandinavian countries. That's your average sensible basket, the most relevant basket, European countries. And then the deficit there is, what's that, 4 times higher. So effectively, had any of those governments been setting Scotland's public spending budget, then we would have got 4 times more, right, than we get generosity from the UK, right? And why is this? That's because of 50 years of neoliberal extremism in the UK. 50 years when we've had a Tory party that has been allowed to indulge its neoliberalness, and then a Labour Party that by the time they get to power, they have to go with it, and back, and here we are, and we're still there, right?
And that massive gap of equality between the top and the bottom as well. Right. That's huge.
It's staggering, right? When you look at that, right? And then you think about them, well, why is it then? That explains why child mortality is so much higher in the UK. Why for the first time since the 19th century, children on average are shorter, right, in the UK. Now, there's a difference between Scotland and England, we'll come back to, but they're shorter. That's since the Gordon Brown era, right? For the first time ever, on average, 5-year-old boys and girls born in the UK are shorter, and they're confident this is all to do with diet. And this is it. This is inequality. This is what happens when the government is allowed to spend less and less money on looking after the people that are the most vulnerable. And so Scotland, yes, dividend, but time out. Stand back and look at what is normal in the rest of Europe, and we never get near that. The dividend argument never gets anywhere close to that in the way that it's consumed and played back to us by the establishment.
Yeah, right. So they're cherry picking it. They'll say, "Oh, look, Scotland is is so much better off than other parts because we're so generous," but they don't bother showing us that other bit of the graph. And I mean, that looked like, I don't know, 3 times the amount of spending. That's presumably, it's not because their GDP is 3 times per head of the population. It's just political choices about where to spend money and where not to spend money.
That's
that point on GDP actually is Scotland isn't poor by any means compared to the others.
Certainly not. I mean, and that's right. The thing that makes the government spend so much less than other countries is our political system, right? And the other work I've been doing, sort of like can prove this again with data, that what happens in the UK, the US, and to a great extent in Canada and Australia is because you've only got 2 parties, right? The way that then evolves, it means that there is not sufficient strength in the progressive voice to ensure that year on year, or at least political business cycle on cycle, it retains a commitment to things like welfare spending and health spending and so on. Yeah. And that's why this is why Brexit, this is why Trump, is because we have emaciated, we've emasculated, we've rendered impotent the progressive voice in our politics to the extent that it's no longer able to do its job.
Could you just talk us through that slide?
So, I mean, it's meant to be a summary of the end of having come to do this link between right-wing politics, neoliberalism, and extreme inequality, right? So those are the themes that it's trying to sort of explain there. So it's trying to tell you that since 1980, our world has been very slowly spiraling out of control. Yeah. So the Tories unleash this Thatcherism, which we know is extreme neoliberalism. Inequality rises to the highest level. That rise in inequality is hand in hand with the switch in the labour movement away from old-fashioned sort of progressive politics to this third way thing that Blair and sort of Clinton espoused, which means nothing changes really. Yeah. That's another thing. I've got a dedicated section on the Labour Party. They still like to talk about Blair and the increase in spending and so on. But actually, they didn't really move the dial at all. They just looked after what they inherited and then handed it on for some more, which is what you get in the 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock with the clock, Brexit, and then you're saying, well, what's going to come next? And what's coming next, as we know, is reform.
Yes,
Yes,
and I mean
indeed.
that is in some ways that is fascinating when you think in terms of all the things you just said about first past the post creates a two-party system. Suddenly we've got this third party, and they're all neck and neck in UK voting intention at the moment. How does that affect the way this works? I mean, in a first past the post, presumably whoever wins might be winning by the tiniest of margin and have maybe 30% of the vote. Is that what you think is?
Well, which is where Labour is at the moment, isn't it? It won
Well,
with
exactly.
about 30% of the vote.
That's right. I
Exactly.
mean, they only did as well as they did because reform ate into the Tory vote. So there's all that stuff, as you say.
But right now they're all fighting for the right-wing voters. So that is going to drive this austerity, inequality agenda even more.
And that's right. And so, like, the most recent stuff I've been doing tries to just surface then why this doesn't happen in Sweden and Germany and, Switzerland and the Netherlands and so on, like, because they, as we all know, again, the British press are very keen to tell us about the far right parties that actually get into government in these countries, and it allows you to think, well, at least we're quite moderate here in the UK. Labour, Tory, and this piece of work that it shows part of my campaigning work is to find a way of presenting that PR isn't some nice to have, like, and it's just a friendlier, more diverse, sort of better way of calculating democracy. It's actually the difference is evidenced by this stuff between running into the ground, which is what's happened to the UK, and actually not running into ground, which is what's happening.
Yeah.
Well, I rather like this. So, it's linking first past the post with inequality, isn't it? So the ladder on the right, it's presumably that represents us, whereas the people on the bleachers at the left-hand side of that image, are they countries where there's more consensus politics,
That's right.
more proportional representation? Yeah.
Well, that's it. It's as black and white as that. Countries that use PR have all those things: consensus. A much more balanced, moderated, compromised sort of outcome in terms of government and what they do and so on. And countries that have first past the post end up with this extreme.
It's really interesting when you think of the Reform UK, the possibility that I think at the moment they're looking to get maybe 6 seats in Holyrood on voting intention. Now we're kind of appalled at that, and it's more than the Greens are likely to get, and it's certainly more than some of the smaller indie parties, but actually 6 seats out of 129 is not a massive voice, and that's still fairer, even though it's horrible to think that they're going to be in there. That's still right. Fairer than a first past the post system.
That's exactly right. And that's the argument, and again, it starts sounding like a spurious sort of theoretical one when you say, look, if that's what people vote for, then we should get them into power.
That's what they should get,
right. But what happens on the continent is that these parties, because they live in a world where the ladder is much more balanced, right? Then the far right parties have to commit to sensible things like welfare spending, right?
Yeah.
So this is where not even the Labour Party does that here, and it goes back to, one of the most amazing things about the difference between first past the post and PR is turnout. Okay, so reasonably well known, so much better turnout, PR countries, much better engagement and so on than here, right? So this is it, and that graph on the right is the key one, and the absolutely key point of the graph is that turnout is at its lowest amongst the seriously disenfranchised, the poorest, the lowest income people in the first past the post countries. So what my most recent work has done, and I've done, I'm working with a guy at Oxford on this, to try and find a way of getting it out more widely, is that you can then show that because these people in that part of society, the lower income people, disengage, then there is no one to push the progressive envelope. Yeah. And that's why the Labour Party... So
the gap gets bigger and bigger.
It's bigger because no one, the Labour Party, there's no point in marketing, higher welfare spending. Well, it's not no point. It'll be damaging for them because they're dealing now with their audience's middle class. They don't want to hear more government spending, right? They want to hear less, in which case they stop doing it. It's exactly what's happened with the Democrats. It's one of the reasons why the face of US politics is so ugly, is because it's motivated and driven by people who think they've got nothing to lose, worn down by this. You don't get that in Germany and the Scandinavian countries and in the Netherlands, because there's still huge engagement, right? The frustration we see from these people and their reaction to the far right is often like either people that feel less, happy or the more disenfranchised, but it's a reaction to things much more superficial, the change in the face of society because of immigration and so on. There's no structural, fundamental, decades worth of misery underpinning and driving the rise of the far right in these countries.
Just last week's podcast, we had Scottish CND on, and they're doing a campaign reclaiming our Clyde. And one of the reasons that one of the groups they're focusing on is young folk, because they tend to be pro-Indy, they tend to be anti-nuclear, but they don't vote. And I've just now sort of made the connection in that slide with, if you look at young people just now, they can't afford to get houses, they can't afford it, they're on minimum wage. Despite the best efforts of Scotland to educate its people, there's still, because of the rates of wages and the gap between where you start and where the bosses are, you can kind of see why that's fueling the disengagement of young and their disinclination to vote, which is tragic, really.
And then there's a sort of follow-on, isn't it? Because, they're not in a good place themselves in terms of any of those, well-being factors that would help make a life feel more, meaningful, enjoyable, whatever. But also people lose faith in politicians, don't they? And then, of course, we'll think, well, what and why I'm not going to bother voting, because nothing ever changes, or Tories are just the same as whoever, and the Labour are just kind of red Tories. So that just all exacerbates that pattern, doesn't it? The folk who really could push it are going, I'm not going to bother. And as you said, that means there's no kind of momentum there against the politicians who then do get into power to do something about to help us. And presumably that then means that the whole thing about inequality and more of the cash, as it were, or at least assets being held by a less and less proportion of the population. It's a spiral, isn't it?
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. That's exactly it. And this is the thing about voter disengagement. And again, the most recent stuff I've been doing shows, you can plot using its Ipsos Mori poll data all the way back to 1980, and you can see exactly where it was that the lower income people, and included in that is young people, as you say, there's a different sort of like phenomenon there, but and it coincides perfectly with the spike or the peak of rising inequality, which like rockets back up to sort of like 1930s levels from 1980. 1979. So Britain was actually a more equal country than any other country apart from Sweden. Okay, yet you think about what we get told about the 1970s and the way that that's played back to us. It's all about winters of discontent and rats running about everywhere, and it's played back just like it was an absolute disaster. Yet that decade was, if that decade had survived and we'd stayed the same, our movement would be nowhere, because you would have achieved this utopia of equality that effectively we know the Scandinavian countries have achieved.
That is a key message, isn't it? Because that's coming back to, we cannot fix this while we're in the UK. We can fix this as an independent country. Who do we aim that message at? Is it the disenfranchised, disaffected voters? Is it the politicians? Is it just Joe Public in the street? So who are you aiming your messaging at?
Absolutely. I mean, that's exactly the challenge, right? And of course, if it all comes down to selling people electoral reform, then it is quite difficult. But effectively, that's it. It's like a real. Again, I don't know if you would label it this, but it's a real project here. It's saying, look, if we stay in a country, right, where the system is so failing, then it just gets worse and worse. Then that's it. Independence is the only way out of this. Obviously, we've got a PR system in Edinburgh, and it's now 25 years old, and we know how it works, and we can see how it works, and people are used to it, and so on. So we've actually done that bit, and it's there, and the likelihood of that going away, and so. It's trying to get away from arguing about things like currency and talking about real things like, do you want to live in a more equal society? Being told, well, we don't have enough money, so we'll really look, and then trying to get people to accept and understand the reason for much of the poverty in Scotland and the rest of the UK is because of the behaviour of the government. That's tied to the cycle we're in. So it's a difficult one.
When you think about who Labour are attacking right now, it's all those groups that are already on the margins. So it's got your poor folk, you're disabled, you're young, you're old. You know, so the only ones in the middle that they are refusing to tax and refusing to try and upset is the rich, particularly the rich minority at the very top. And that, you can see that being echoed, you know, the America's far further down that route than even we are.
Yeah.
That's the way it's heading, isn't it? I mean,
That's
I just find that such an appalling prospect for our future that, but obviously I am sold on the idea of independence, but the idea that we are going down that space unless we do something, that just makes me want even more to get out of here.
I know.
Do you get any optimism that either the Tory or the Labour Party in the UK would grasp that nettle and push through to a proportional setup? I mean, to be honest, I can't see the Tories ever doing it, but you know, Labour, they could do it right now if they wanted to. They've got a massive majority.
Oh, absolutely. And of course,
But
this
they wouldn't have a massive majority if
well,
they
exactly.
Right. And then actually one of the sections on my website there is about turkeys voting for Christmas, right? And it's called that.
Yeah.
And it has an attempt to sort of, you know, it's got a picture of a turkey with a Labour Party sort of badge on it. And you know, it sounds like I'm being super cynical here, but you know, there's a movement right within the Labour Party called, I think it's Labour for New Democracy, and it's full of like young, engaged, enthusiastic people that work really hard to try and convince people in the Labour Party that PR is the way forward. And you know, they do fringe events at the conference, and I listen and I contribute. You know, I'm sort of very interested to see, because they are the, you know, if they won that argument, right, then that's how it changes, but only through the Labour Party. But of course, the Parliamentary Labour Party won't do it. Why? Because it's stuffed full of career politicians, you know, Starmer down, who've got this window, the shot at power they've waited a generation for, and they know it won't come back for another generation. Are they going to trade that, right, to go and do something that will, as you rightly pointed out, probably end up, you know, maybe not in the short term, but eventually destroying the Labour Party, right? No way. In fact, this, I think, would be an even bigger fight than the sort of like English British establishment put up over Brexit, because this would fundamentally change everything, because it would introduce real progressive power and voices. It would take on things like, you know, what do we do about land? How do we tax land? You know, all these things. It would be such a change that I think that would be one of the most monumental battles you would ever see in terms of like referenda. You know, I mean, you saw how hard they fought for the AV vote in 2011. I mean, the funding level there. This is where they say that the Brexit campaign in England cut its teeth. The funding level for the status quo was like 4 or 5 times the size of the Liberal-led pro-EV vote, and there were funders there ready to do more and so on. Like they bankrolled it, right? And the same would happen again.
I mean, just as you know, the Unionists will put a spin on in Scotland about our Union Dividend, there's a spin that gets put on keeping the first past the post, isn't it? Because it leads to stable governments, and you don't get all this, you know, kind of bargaining chips that go on in the rest of Europe, despite the fact that the rest of the Europe are actually getting on fine doing that. Yeah,
but that's right. They sneer at, you know, every time, even the Dutch, they waited something like 8 months right from the election.
Yeah.
You can imagine it's preposterous. But then actually what the Dutch have done is they built a tailor-made solution to their problems, some of which are neoliberally inspired. They've got housing problems, nothing like as bad as ours, and nothing is as bad anywhere, right, in terms of like serious, you know, social problems that we live with in the UK. But what they've ended up with is they've got a rather unpleasant-looking far-right party in their parliament, in their cabinet, but it's harnessed down and it's shaped and tempered and compromised by the emergence of 2 new parties. One party specifically to help farmers with their, you know, EU pollution challenge. Another party that came from nowhere, that wasn't even in existence before, you know, a year before the election, that targets dealing with probity in government and you know, like just sort of failed behaviour in across like establishment parties. And then the fourth party is one of the old establishment parties, and they've come together and they've got this arrangement which recognises that they've got to do something about at least the perception of immigration. I think everybody recognises and knows that there isn't a problem with that per se, but they've got to deal with the EU challenges. So you've got enough, if you want, momentum, you know, that reflects what people want, but it's recast in a government that's actually playing back what's been asked for. You look at what we got in July. we've got this like middle of the road Labour Party that and 4 million people voted for reform, and there's no link with any of that. It feels like it's a pressure cooker. It's going to, and it will. My expectation is that reform will win the next general election, and maybe that's an opportunity for us. But do we want to go down that road to,
I mean, it was bad enough with Johnson. Surely we're not going to put up with Farage being Prime Minister.
I suppose, but it's interesting that, isn't it? Because I suppose that might push because even if he did become Prime Minister, he wouldn't have more than 50% of the seats in Westminster. So maybe, something like that would push the other parties to go, okay, so now we've really done it. We need to get going. Do we need to work together to do something about, something about proportional representation? You never know. It might be the last straw, really.
Yeah.
When you describe what happened there in the Netherlands, it's exciting, isn't it? It's exciting to hear how people who want to be in politics and have got ideas work out ways to work together to make the country better, or to look at specifically what problems in this decade and what we're going to do about it. It just sounds so exciting, and actually I think it'll be like that once Scotland's independent. I mean, I think at the moment, we've just got to kind of get through that, and I think that means, depending on the SNP to do it, pushing them as hard as possible. But after that, there'll be all sorts of new parties, and we can I'd vote for the one that was going to do something about land reform.
Are you sharing this with SNP?
Yeah, that's a good
ministers?
You talking to them?
I've got a dialogue with. I mean, I live in Linlithgow, so I speak to some local people here, and but my plan has been, and I've agreed this with them, that I'm trying to just build credibility, right? And I don't, the interesting thing is, it's typically the groups and campaign groups and think tanks in England that are most interested in this because of the PR element, right? So I've developed a network of really strong connections there. And the thinking is, right, if I'm standing or appear to be standing outside the indie tent, but I can bring some of this, the power and the data, the objective side of it, then maybe that helps persuade people without having to do it from within, the SNP. I would like them to be more helpful. However, some of the stuff we talked about here, I mean, the big weakness in what I'm doing is, as you can tell, is I've not worked out how to bring, electoral reform or the accountancy side of the dividend and make it digestible and accessible. That's the real challenge, isn't it?
It's such a big topic, isn't it? But I'm just thinking that point you make there about standing outside, taking it outside of the sort of indie debate. I'm seeing more of that, and the one that sprung to mind just when you were talking is Leslie Riddick's The Building a Local Scotland campaign, which is about local democracy. And there's links between that and engaging people in the decision-making process. So is there something through that route?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm trying to work with all those groups to see if there's interest, and there is, and so yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the thinking here, is that there's definitely a black and white route through this. This isn't having to sell people a dream or be motivated about it. And again, I don't like using the term Project Fear, but it is, I'm afraid, it's a real Project Fear, saying inaction means more of this, and it's just going to get worse.
And it's so, once you lay out the facts, the data, you don't have to make an argument for it. It slaps you in the face. I'm just trying to think, how can we help you on this mission of getting the word out? I mean, you've got a website. Presumably all this information can be downloaded and people could be sharing it and putting it on social media and that kind of stuff.
Yes.
I mean, it's powerful, powerful stuff, especially just now when we're in this sort of environment where you don't really know what facts are at the moment.
The other kind of angle maybe is we'd have to be careful how this was presented. But there is an argument, isn't it, about no wonder, we've had a Scottish government for 25 years and they haven't done some of the things that we really wish they had done. I mean, now you have to be careful how you put that.
Yeah.
But you've got data in there that sort of goes, yeah, well, it's because of that, and that would be good to get more, into people's heads.
One of the things I have been trying to do with the SNP and I haven't heard from yet is there's a professor of geography in Oxford who is a Labour Party member, but he's the leading voice on inequality. This guy, I mean, he's
Danny Dorling,
right? right? Yeah, Danny Darling. So you probably maybe.
Oh yeah. Well, actually, I'd really like to get him onto the podcast, but we haven't done that yet. But I've read some of his stuff. It's just brilliant, and I know that he's so kind of behind the whole thing about, for example, the Scottish child payment.
Right. So that's exactly the point I was going to come to. So I ironing shirts one Sunday night, I stumbled across him talking to a Labour Party meeting in Lewes. I think it's Lewes it's called in Sussex. Okay. And he was, talking away, and he's obviously there to speak about inequality. Like, he's very much from the progressive side of the English Labour movement, as you know. And then he alights upon things that could be done, but he knows are not going to be done in Starmer's government. For example, how they might use their fiscal levers around certain benefit payments and so on to change outcomes for the needy, the seriously poor. And he starts talking about this country somewhere in Europe that has done this, that has a blueprint, and it's improved its child mortality and its stats at school, and its overall well-being and so on. He goes on for a couple of minutes and then he says to the room, he says, and which country is that? And there's this pause, and then eventually someone goes, Scotland, right? So here's this guy, right, in England, who's a Labour Party member in England, talking to the English Labour Party, using the experience of Scotland. Now, this is not a pro-SNP stuff. This is just talking about what you can do with relatively small amounts of government money to lift the relevant people areas out of poverty and increase life chances, literally overnight. And I'm thinking that is something surely the SNP has to harness and use. They've not asked this guy to do it. He's done it independently. He's just making the case for a set of simple, ordinary, relatively modest, progressive ideas.
Yeah. And isn't it ironic that Scottish Labour would stand up in Holyrood every week and denigrate those all of those. Yeah.
I find that it's so frustrating, isn't it? If I'm watching something, say from the Commons, and there's someone, well, now it's from the Labour Party up on their feet, and I heard someone the other day talking about bringing in more free school meals, and of course that's a great idea. But I was thinking, and wouldn't it just be great if you said there's a really good model for doing that in Scotland that Holyrood have brought in, and we're going to have a look at it, and it's just it never happens, and partly it doesn't happen because of all the antipathy. I mean, it's not just the constitutional stuff; it's the antipathy between the Labour Party and the SNP, because the SNP burst their Scottish bubble.
Right.
And have you come across an economist called Diane Coyle? She's one of the leading lights at a Cambridge department called the Barnett Institute for Economics. She writes books that, first of all, I haven't read them all, and the ones I have read, they are quite hard going, but she does write very, it's not dry stuff. And she's basically kind of saying, look, our economics, something like GDP, yes, it measures things, but it doesn't measure what we need to measure. Yeah. And she comes in from that, again, it's that progressive socialist voice. How do we help the people that really need help? And what can, she as an economist and, her colleagues do about it? And the way she writes, actually, it kind of reminds me about how Danny Darling writes as well.
Yeah.
Is there a well-being angle to that as well?
Yes, there is.
Well-being economy,
Yeah, there is.
I'm doing work with a couple of think tanks in England on electoral reform. And then my plan would be to write a book. Again, I've input from various people suggest that there's enough there to do that. Yeah. But I suppose my goal would be to find a way of just making it super accessible and getting it layered into the messaging. Ideally, I need to find another level, don't I, to sort of bring it out. You've got
the detailed level, and you've done the spade work, you've done the research, and you can understand it and back it up and explain it. And I would suggest it probably some of these graphs that you've got that we've been looking at today are fine, Find some way of making half a dozen key points really clear and really punch you in the face.
On the website, there is you've got sort of headline conclusions at one point, just written out. So I put those together, and just as I did that little put together for what Liz Smith said, I put those headline ones together, and I'll just put.
And if you like them, you can have it.
You can have it. We do that kind of thing because it's only half a minute, and you can stick it on TikTok. And people see it, and if you then put a link, say, to your website, then some people we'll go and have a look. Our recent guest, Stuart Donald, has been debunking the so-called Union Dividend, and he's come up with some headline conclusions from his research. Scotland has become the sickest and the oldest among our European peer nations. Look at the death rate. We're way ahead of the rest of the UK, way ahead of European peers. Only Finland was worse than ours, but they did something about it. We had 30 years then of people leaving Scotland. Probably they were younger Scots, and that has skewed our population average age. 1970s, we held steady. 1980s, populating dropped. 1990s, we held steady again. But that has a knock-on effect when it comes to the percentage of our population over 65. You can see it's going up and up and up, and again, we're way ahead of everybody else. But since the 2000s, actually, our population had been rising. And then it stopped. Why? Brexit. Look at that. Number of new national insurance numbers issued for migrants to Scotland, it goes up. Brexit happens, it slips back down again. We can't afford that. And anyway, our so-called Union Dividend is less than what all other European peer nations spend on core services. Services like health, education and welfare. Just look at the difference between what they manage to do and what we manage to do as part of the United Kingdom. Our GDP is actually strong enough to support higher spending, but it's impossible under Tory and Labour austerity consensus. What are we going to do about it?
Yeah, brilliant.
So,
Fantastic.
it's pretty easy to do that, and I just get people's attention. Did that on Canva. That wasn't
Right.
hard to do.
You could do a TikTok version, and we don't do Twitter anymore, but Blue Sky we do. Lots of different things to try, and who knows which ones will work. But
Yeah.
the more ways you do it, the more chances
Yeah.
there's something.
Yeah.
No, that's right. No, that's
Yeah.
great. I mean, it's great advice. I met a guy at the Equality Trust who were the first people that spoke to me, and he suggested this, like, what's it called, edutainment thing. So not just similar to what you've done there, but somewhat online. A lot of the history guys do it really well. So I've been trying to. I would get my daughter to help me with that.
It's been really good talking to you, actually. I really appreciated it, because I did really like the website, but there is a hell of a lot on it. So it's great kind of, having a discussion here and kind of understanding it a bit more deeply.
Fantastic.
Good.
Wow, that was a wonderful immersion in a whole load of fascinating stats. And it's an eye-opener. It's an absolute eye-opener. Things you think you know, and actually we don't know them.
Yeah, if you've listened to any of our live stream programs, you've probably heard me going off on a rant a few times. And yet the rant is usually about sort of my frustration when you see the mainstream media and you go, yeah, that is a story, but you haven't put it into context. You haven't done the comparisons. You're just leaving us high and dry because you want to spin it, and you want to make a particular anti-Scottish government effect, really. So I just think if we could get so much more of Stuart's research out there and into people's minds, and find some ways so that it makes an impact, and then hopefully that would also enthuse people to go onto his website and look at it.
Use it as well. I mean, the information he's got on things like the male death statistics and the population decline. I mean, some of those slides that he put up, they could be used for all sorts of things.
Indeed, I mean, that one about the effect of Brexit on the immigration. And just going to put in a wee plug here for a blog post. So Stuart mentioned that our GDP is strong enough to take things further and do more in the way that our peer European nations can. But there is a whole question about GDP and how you measure it. And I was listening to Professor Dame Diane Coyle on the Today programme, and they had her on talking about GDP and its limitations, and she's got a new book about it. So I have decided I'm going to put up a blog post about that. So have a look on our website for the blog post.
So there you go. Let's hope we've all learned a bit today. And thanks again to Stuart. I have a feeling we might be inviting him back in the future.
Exactly.
Certainly thoroughly enjoyed chatting to him and learned a lot. So thank you, Stuart.
And I hope you enjoyed the voiceover on the Scottish Tory spin about the Union Dividend, because I thought it was hilarious. Bye.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out, so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.